Hello, this is Kris Nelson from evolvedconsciousness.org. I'll be reading Part 3 of Symbolism and Consciousness. Belief is powerful. Once the influence of language on consciousness and the connection between symbols and reality are more deeply understood, the power of consciousness is understood to a greater extent as well. The double-edged sword of consciousness can become more apparent. Higher order consciousness that human animals have is an imagination factory powered by an abstraction engine. We have the power to abstract anything, pure imagination. We have the capacity for great freedom, but we can also enslave ourselves to great degrees because of the inventions and fantasy of our minds from subjective unreality, the unreality that becomes imposed on the objective reality that exists, where we create the unreality into reality. This is how money was created, as well as governments, religions, etc. They are all human inventions from imagination, and they are not the great freedom kind, not the kind of imaginations which can provide us with freedom as new potential ways of living compared to the current and old ways of living, which are not as good, less freeing and less moral. So they are all human inventions, all the government, religions, money, and many other things that we've created that didn't exist inherently, from imagination. And they are not the great kind of freedom, but rather the enslaving kind of inventions from imagination. All order followers believe what they believe, which has them do what they do. They wouldn't do what they wouldn't do if they didn't have the beliefs that allowed them to believe what they do is right, that what they do is good. So they do what they do. Order followers follow orders because of the beliefs that that is a good thing to do, that that is required. The belief that they need money to survive, and that they need to do this job of being an order follower and enslaving other people by following orders. And we're all order followers to a lesser extent when we are immersed in society and an environment that has impositions and imposes things upon us to fashion us into certain behavioral mechanisms. We follow orders and we do what others say, and we follow orders from our parents. We do what they say from an early age, and then later on we join collectives and groups and we do what they do. So we're always following orders, and to some extent, most of our lives, at least for most people. But the order followers that I'm referring to are the controller order followers. Other animals have more freedom in this sense because they are not concerned with inventing beliefs. They are also not trying to answer questions that may not be answerable, questions about our meaning and purpose. Humans seem to need to find something to give themselves towards as a purpose in life, such as joining the army, devotion to a church, or devotion to a corporation or a company. There are many pre-selected pathways to channel our energy into, to rechannel the universal constructability of our creative and generative capacities. So when society has certain constructs such as the army, church, government, a company, corporation, and you give yourself to it, you feel like you're a part of something bigger than you, and it provides a sense of comfort, a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Other animals have their lives and they live it. Humans have lives just as other animals, but the non-human animals live in mostly a base consciousness of survival and seeking the pleasure and avoiding the pain, with limited constructability to create and alter the environment. This is a limiting modality of life with little higher order purpose, meaning, and value. They just have a basic purpose and value and survival. We can envision anything and think of anything, so we can create meanings and purposes and derive meaning and purposes for ourselves that's different from others. Humans can try to grasp at imagined questions of value, meaning, and purpose, and inventing answers to those questions through the power of consciousness. This is where trouble can present itself as a divergence from objective reality. Ideas, concepts, and beliefs from imaginative consciousness may not be representative of objective reality and can give meaning and purpose in life. To do things based on these beliefs that provide answers alleviate fear of the unknown, doubt, insecurity, and discomfort. Plugging up a hole of unanswered darkness with an answer is more comforting. Not having an answer is fine. To find the answer requires being more grounded in reality to look at how our understanding of reality can be enhanced through an understanding of reality itself by connecting our imagination with reality and verifying if it is accurate. If you are driven to know what cannot be known with certainty, you may drive yourself mad. So I've mentioned this in part 1 and 2, mentioned Bertrand Russell and trying to solve his paradox, and eventually he gave up on it because he realized he was wrong and he was trying to prove something that can't be proven, trying to find an answer to a question that you can't have an answer to because it's your basis. You've created a paradoxes, and paradoxes don't exist. So in your formulation of a conception, you formulated something incorrectly and you think it can be proven, but it can't because you didn't analyze and conceive of your concept properly. Sometimes, for your own survival and sanity, you must reconcile yourself with accepting that you may never know a certain thing or even be able to. The pursuit of uncertain unknowns can consume you entirely. It can become an attachment. We have a question, and we need to find an answer to alleviate the insecurity, doubt, and uncertainty of not knowing. Some things cannot be known, and to strive to know them can drive one to lose sight of reality in such attachments. We create words as symbolic reflections of our imaginations that mirror reality. We then produce images in our mind through words alone, rather than thinking about all the pieces that create the meaning of the word. The words become a reflection of reality themselves. Whether they are real or not, we imbue them with meaning and give them reality. This is the danger of the double-edged sword of consciousness with regard to concepts and symbols or word creation. We use words as if they were literal aspects of reality, like our arms or hands that we make use of. But not all words that represent concepts and ideas are actually real. We give them the power of reality simply by the imagination and belief that is automatically granted through the use of words as a reference to reality. We manifest unreality into objective reality from the subjective reality of our minds. We can create an imagined subjective reality used to explain something. Doesn't mean that it's real, but we've created correspondences and analogies, and then we imagine something and we try to explain reality through that imagination. It can work and it cannot work. Here I have a quote from a book, Science and Consciousness, Two Views of the Universe. Giving a name to an object normally constitutes, through the imaginal, the recognition of it. If it does not, then, like Schneider, you will have to go over it by touch, like something in the dark or a fact in the mind. When symbol, from the pre-reflective imaginary, and sign, from the reflexive symbolic, are reversibly joined by the meaning with the transreflective imaginal, which the transreflective imaginal establishes, the meaning springs out of the word or the object and makes its appearance, ready-made and armed into our consciousness like Athena springing out of the head of Zeus. The object and the word are then inhabited by the meaning. So that's what he was saying when you give a name to an object, you give recognition to it. And the symbol and the sign, joined by the meaning, then the meaning springs out of the word and the object and makes appearances in your mind. So the object and word are then inhabited by the meaning. Then the deep structure of speech of Chomsky and its surface structure are linked together. The conceptual signification, the reflexive, is based on the gestural signification, pre-reflexive, but through the archetypal transreflexive signification. archetypal and gestural, imaginal and imaginary significations establish the word. Archetypal and conceptual, imaginal and symbolic, establish the language. Word and language establish the individual's language system with its deep structure, the word immanent to the archetypal and gestural meaning, and its surface structure, which is the language immanent to the archetypal and conceptual significations. The linguistic sign, more simply the word, then exists just as exists my intersensory world, more simply things. And from then on I use words as I use my arm or my hand, always on condition that these words, the conceptual meaning, are connected to the gestural meaning by means of the archetype imaginal transcendental function, the word, the verbal image, the acoustic sign, the linguistic sign signifying and signified, then become, as it were, the experienced representation of my arm or my hand. They live in me and live concurrently in the objects they designate. So when I read that, the big part that stuck out was the importance of this person describing objects and imagination and the recognition of it, and the symbol, the sign, the meaning, and how it's like using our arms or our hands. It just becomes a part of ourselves when we use words, even words that don't actually reflect things in reality. We can attribute imaginal concepts and symbols that describe those concepts as actual things in reality when they're just imaginal. So here I have one source describing language symbol development and who used it first. The alphabet eventually enabled more people to become literate, explains Gil Stein, director of the Oriental Institute. Writing in its earliest forms was first and foremost a tool that priests, officials, and scribes used as a key element in the functioning of a state bureaucracy. We estimate that literacy was limited to less than 1% of the population of the earliest states, so it was rare for even kings to know how to read and write. In this context, it is hardly surprising that the earliest writing and the written word itself would have seemed mysterious, powerful, and even inspired by gods. And that's why Egyptian hieroglyphs are called metu neter, which is words of the gods. That's exactly what symbols are. The ones who invented the symbols were the priests, officials, and scribes who might have even know how to read and create the structure for the figurehead king pharaoh to rule, but they were the actual rulers behind the scenes. And there's a lot of evidence for this throughout history. Many different cultures where you have a figurehead, a puppet. Right now you can just look at how our democratic systems, and there's puppet figureheads of presidents and prime ministers, but behind the scenes they don't actually have the power, they just do what they're told. So the priests, officials, and scribes had the power, and the ruler just ruled according to how they were supposed to rule, according to the symbols and the narratives and the power of the symbols, the words of God, as described by the priests, the viziers of God. The importance of symbols in conceptual thought constructs is ever present in a religious priestly context and the development of civilization through religious influence. These priests are the magicians and sorcerers of the science of imagery, of symbols, and their power to influence consciousness. When the literal interpretations of the narratives are given, they do not always impart much useful knowledge about life. The narratives we read are taken as literal beliefs that the ancient people had when they wrote them down. The underlying esoteric symbolism through the power of imagery in metaphor, analogy, allegory, and parables is not often explained. Mythology and narratives of cultures may have had a literal following, but it is also encoding ancient wisdom that was either developed by different cultures about inherent truths in reality and ourselves, or they may likely be a pre-flood, pre-ice age civilization that original wisdom survived through creation myths and narratives being developed to use and encode the wisdom. This method of imagery symbolism is used in the Bible as well. So we have the exoteric layer, such as literal rituals of the afterlife. This is theology. And then we have, say, esoteric level 1, which is symbolism for astrotheology, since it was based on nature. You can view the information of the stars in precession. There's a lot of astrotheological aspects within the Bible and other ancient teachings. So this would be sun theology instead of just abstract theology and religion. This would be more about reality. And then you have esoteric level 2, which is symbolism for psychology, philosophy, self-knowledge here and now. So even the first layer, when I got into astrotheology and I was like, oh, that's what it's about. Oh, look at that. They're encoding the information about the stars and the sun and the moon. But that's only esoteric level 1 below the exoteric literal narratives and stories. But the deeper wisdom is esoteric level 2, which is about self-knowledge and ourselves, consciousness, psychology, etc. Humans can invent any concept, any invention of fantasy, and project it externally into some imagined aspect of reality, true or false. From stories, narratives, to politics and power, do you see the problem? They may be true, but they may and most likely are not true. They are tools of imagery to manipulate. What truth can be objectively discerned from within the symbolism? The esoteric, occulted dimensions of living in here and now, from the past into the future. Symbolism of consciousness and life. It all snowballs from original useful information about life that gets junk narratives and additional meaning added to weave a story that uses the symbolic imagery, and then it eventually becomes literal as a religion. Many interpretations of Egyptian narratives and symbols focuses on the exoteric narrative. They portrayed the Egyptians as being obsessed with the afterlife and not with real life, and created symbols to reflect this understanding. So they imagine, oh, the symbols that they see, they're seeing the exoteric narrative, so they're saying, oh, well, the Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. That was their main goal, because that's the symbols that we see them describing. So as if this knowledge and purpose of an afterlife was the ultimate spiritual purpose in this life for these ancient peoples. So that's what the Egyptologists are presuming and assuming, based on the symbols that are left behind that would have represented the beliefs of the people. So yes, there would have been those beliefs of the people in terms of exoteric and public consciousness in order to manipulate them, but then there's also the esoteric knowledge about how to live life here and now that was more important. Why is this propagated exoterically? The whole narratives of the afterlife and feeding your ka and all this ridiculousness. Why do priests and controllers want this exoteric narrative to be accepted by people? You get people to fixate on an afterlife, and they will submit to your authority and enslavement in this life. Because this life is only preparation for the next, and you need to follow their divine authority to get there. This system of enslavement through the science of imagery, belief, and phantasms was also done in India. This is a common motif in all of the religious doctrines of the world, gaining obedience from people with the imagery of stories and narratives. Here I have a quote from Adam Curtis, the book Bitter Lake. Increasingly, we live in a world where nothing makes sense. Events come and go like waves of a fever, leaving us confused and uncertain. Those in power tell stories to help us make sense of the complexity of reality. Those stories are increasingly unconvincing and hollow. So this person doesn't understand much of the esoteric aspect and the occulted aspect of reality and the hidden hand and how things really work. They're trying to use if you read the whole page, they're using apologetics to excuse what the leaders and politicians are doing. Oh, well, they're just telling stories to help us pathetic, stupid masses, make sense of the complexity of reality. So it's okay that they lie and they make stories. And it's okay that that's been done for thousands of years. No, it's not. That's the root of belief, and people believing fantasy and beliefs as reality because they're using these stories and narratives, these beliefs, to make sense of the complexity of reality, but it doesn't reflect reality. It's just a story, fantasy, imagination. So he doesn't even understand the quote that I just read. The person who wrote it doesn't even understand the depths of how accurate it is and the more levels of accuracy of what they're saying and how it applies to these storytellers. The narratives and stories of gods may have started off in meaningful symbolism about this life, but got twisted into literal meanings to manipulate people into focusing on another reality, another realm, while allowing wrongs as right, evil as good, immorality as morality, all under the guise of authority from God, priests, controllers, pharaohs, kings, etc. If you don't understand this about history and writing, about symbols and the use of symbols to manipulate consciousness, then you will likely dismiss this assessment and consider the literal interpretation as explicitly put forth in narratives and stories as accurate, and the true wisdom put forth in the explicit manner itself. So you're going to think that the wisdom is in the explicit narrative, and there's no wisdom as an esoteric layer. All the wisdom and, oh my God, look at the story, that's the afterlife and eternal life, and that's the truth, that's the wisdom right there. No, it's not. That's the bullshit to get people to believe in. The implicit underlying esoteric meaning and teachings about this reality we live in are ignored and not understood because the symbolism and stories are taken as literal and not figurative personifications of reality and ourselves. Later, stories and symbols are altered to create new narratives and hide the original meaning with the exoteric history creation. So they put the exoteric history fabrication on top of the esoteric layer, and then that becomes the new narrative that's propagated, which still contains the imagery and symbolism for the esoteric layer, but since people don't have the eyes and the ears to see and hear, well, then they can't detect it. Whether it's told to them verbally or they read it, they won't be able to see it. The stories are outright created to manipulate people with an authorized standard of an acceptable story narrative in order to control and manipulate people in this life, with the hope, faith, and belief in the afterlife, which can only be reached through adherence to the laws of the controller priests, kings, or pharaohs, through rituals that mean nothing but are supposed to mean something. They don't mean anything, but they want you to believe that they mean something so that you do them, and then you're going to be a good little citizen, and yay. So just like I mentioned in part 2, birthdays and all these stupid holidays. You got Easter, Christmas, and Halloween, and Thanksgiving. Do your rituals and you're a good little citizen. So this is the history of all empires, rulers, dominators, from Egypt, India, the Levant, Sumer, Europe, everywhere. This is the history of the world. Oh, Mesoamerica too, Aztecs and everything, all that degenerated. You know, it's all stories, and then rulers and dominators use them to rule and dominate. This is the history of the whole world. But some people do not want to accept this fact of history, of authority and enslavement through the science of imagery and false historical creations of stories and narratives to provide legitimacy to authority from God's viceroy, God's hand on earth, God's demigods, God's helpers, God's messengers, God's ruler on earth, God's whatever, all tied to God and divine rulership and authority. So it's all for control. So some people who have ancestry from Africa, and they get this, they develop Afrocentric and infatuation with Egypt, and that it was so great and there was no crimes and there was no punishment, everything was good. That's because that's what they want to believe, and they don't understand actual history, that whenever you have a ruler and you have bullshit narratives used to manipulate people, and you have, oh, the ruler is the one with the godly ka and everyone else doesn't. You know, open your eyes and look at history accurately and see that Egypt managed to last so long because it convinced people through these narratives to follow the rule of law of the state authority, and it was all guised under the veil of the most powerful ka to uphold the most amount of ma'at and live in order and balance of creation. Then they had the Tech renewal festival every year to renew and say that we're renewing things and we're putting things back into balance from the corruption of the previous year. And it's all rituals and bullshit to convince people to stay in line and do as they're told. I am looking at the symbolism and trying to relate it to reality and what I understand about reality and life. There are many symbolic references to reality in teachings, in pictographs or text, in many areas of the planet, and they all vary in some ways and are similar in other ways. These are all from the consciousness of humans who have conceived of concepts, ideas, and beliefs. The beliefs to answer questions of why, when, and how creation occurred, what the meaning and purpose to life is, the mystery of death, etc., and get adopted as religious foundations for human social order, that is to say, control, and they change over time. So these beliefs get created, then they get adopted, they get altered, and then they get used as a religious basis for social order, control, and then eventually they change over time as well. They keep changing and changing. Unless it becomes a religious doctrine, then you're not allowed to change it. Then the belief has to say a belief forever, and it can't be changed, no matter what the truth is. And the church will kill you for it, for blasphemy. These are not right-brained sourced truths from the unconscious spirit tapping into, quote, source, intuition, nous, noesis, gnosis, that are providing accurate frameworks, models for an alleged immortal you beyond this life you live. So they're not these things. It's not right-brained truths and unconsciousness and the collective unconscious and the spirit and the nous and the intuition and the source and the God connection and providing you with these pure truths. No, it's invented by man's mind and then polluted. Whether they were honest reflections or not, they eventually get polluted into being used as tools of manipulation and control. These are invented, imagined, and induced from consciousness to provide us with answers to questions we can imagine and conceive of. Consciousness is an imagination factory with an abstraction engine. Abstractions are what lead to concepts, ideas, and beliefs. It is the power behind imagination and inventing ideas. Our ability to invent ideas is powerful. Simply inventing an idea does not make it true. Study the history of concepts and see how fickle the ability to derive an accurate, fully formed concept of pure knowledge is. It does not happen as often as we would like to think. The more conscious awareness of reality we have, the more potential we have to formulate accurate conceptions based on the accuracy of the previous data points we have accumulated from reality that we live in. From reality we live in. Not from imagination and beliefs and other realities and other dimensions and other planes of existence. That's not how you're going to formulate accurate conceptions about this reality. If we have faulty foundational axioms or faulty data sets, then the resulting constructs of concepts, ideas, or beliefs we create, imagine, or invent will also likely be faulty in some capacity. New information, new insights based on reality can help us correct our previously accepted erroneous information. The point is to always come back to reality and not stay free-floating in belief when we are trying to determine if something is viable as a model. We can create models based in speculation, and it may be possible, but it lacks probability or actualized verifiability in reality. This does not make it false, but it also does not make it true. Verification in reality, quote, science, is helpful to validate if your ideas have a basis in reality, or if they are more in the realm of fantasy, imagination, and speculation. After a long time of being induced, inculcated, invoked, and summoned with these conceptual images of alleged, quote, spiritual aspects, I have been reevaluating these beliefs that cannot be verified into more grounded aspects of reality that do not require any fantasy belief in something that cannot be verified by our own actions or reality. I am taking the journey to ground my understanding in actual reality, not the fantasy of believing whatever I want. This is what I recognize is the problem we are in. Everyone just believes whatever they want. They are not concerned with objective reality, only with what they want to be true, their dream, their imagined desire, and they seek that over seeking to know and understand reality through reality itself. They want to pretend they can understand reality through the unreality of their imagination and make that into a reality. The imaginal realm of consciousness can lead to understanding reality through the refinement and continual discovery of reality itself. Ideas lead to action through creation of new things. Projecting the desires, wishes, and dreams of the imaginal realm onto reality does not make it a reality. You can look at things in terms of belief. You will never be able to demonstrate because it is belief with no objective veracity in reality. It's all subjective. Or you can look at stories and narrative, allegory, analogy, and parable to convey understanding that reflects reality and our capacity to evolve consciousness and live right. So you can look at stories and narratives in terms of literal belief, or you can look at it as a symbolic representation of aspects of reality in ourselves so that we can understand how to live in reality and evolve consciousness, rather than think that these things are actually literal things that exist. I don't deny possibilities. I have different compartments in mind and consciousness for different concepts: possible, probable, and actual. I do not accept beliefs as actual, for they are imaginations that can or cannot be actual and remain as possibilities or probable possibilities. We like things to fit together, to make sense, to be absolute. When someone pokes a hole in our framework or model, we are often reluctant to revise our framework or model because we are attached to the belief in it being accurate in order for things to make sense. This again is tied to the ego-personality identity construct that uses understanding of verifiable truths as well as unverifiable belief in order to construct a self-image, self-concept, sense of self, and a reality image, worldview, and sense of reality. People like things to be absolute. That's why they want God to be absolute. People don't like the relative. Some people like the relative because it allows them to validate whatever they want to do. So moral relativism. But people want an absolute. They want an answer to a question. They don't, oh well, it depends. That's not what people like. We like certainty. We like to know where we're standing, where we're going. It's not that people fear the absolute, like Mark Passio says. It's that they actually want the absolute. There's dual aspects of people who fear the absolute and people who fear the relative. People are more wanting of the absolute than the relative. The relative is more complex. The absolute is simple. It's absolute. So people yearn for the absolute because it simplifies things as an absolute. Then people take conceptual derivations from the imaginal mind and they're going to make it absolutes. And just because you say, oh well, people hate absolutes, the ego hates the absolute, doesn't make your conception valid and automatically legitimate and true. Just because you're saying, oh well, if you refuse what I'm telling you, that's because it's your ego that hates the absolute. No, it could be that what you're saying is false. So just because it's true that some people hate absolutes and more people hate the relative and they prefer the absolute, does not mean you can just use that as a validation to say, oh well, you don't like what I'm saying because oh, the ego hates absolute, so that means you're an ego because you're not accepting what I'm telling you as an absolute. There are certain things that are absolute and true, and there are other things that depend on circumstance. You find someone who just stabbed someone. Well, did they stab someone because the other person had a gun that was about to shoot them, so they defended themselves? Or were they the one as the aggressor who was doing the murdering and taking another life? Or were they defending themselves and they had the right to do it? So it's relative. It's not, oh well, killing is always wrong. No, murder is always wrong, but killing is killing. It's not murder. If it's not murder, then it's killing. Killing is when you have the right to uphold and defend what is right, the law, truth, and good. And sometimes you gotta kill. But murder is someone who's taking another life who has no right to take it. So there's a difference. Everything in reality is relative. Things are in relation to other things. Not everything is the same. It's a part of reality. It's a law of the universe, just like the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle. It goes along with all of this. So anyways, that's the end of this. Nice and short, over 30 minutes. Maybe I'll go reread the first two and make them shorter, because they're an hour and a half and that's too long. Anyways, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a nice day. Take care. Peace.